Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm going to be discussing Johnson Chapter 4, which starts off with the teacher expressing frustration over the concept that we, as educators, accept academic struggles more so than we accept behavior struggles, which basically means that we are more likely to address something like a maladaptive behavior than an actual fundamental educational issue or anything somebody may be struggling with academically. This makes sense because if we're frustrated by bad behavior and maladaptive behaviors, we're going to address them more quickly, and then these silent issues like academic struggles are going to go ignored. So this section ends with an argument on teacher training and why we should preventatively warn teachers to watch out for this kind of thing. So it's basically saying that just because we're frustrated as educators, or maybe it's more obvious to point out things like maladaptive behaviors that we see instead of these underlying academic issues, we still need to be aware of this and make sure that we're helping the kids, not just ourselves, and making everything kind of go easily. We also need to teach and educate. So the next section is on creativity. So the section explains that it's a way, like creativity in general, is a way of labeling behavior instead of saying what we're capable of. So it's saying that we're not capable of a certain amount of creativity, but instead we're labeling these behaviors. Creativity is a behavior or an adjective to describe behavior. So this actually compares to anything that we're learning, because we can either see people as being, capable of a certain fixed amount of things, or we can choose to believe that people can constantly improve and change and grow despite whatever genetic or societal limitations placed on them. And as educators, it's actually really important that we believe that these kids are capable of more than what we see and more than just surface value, because if we place these limitations on them, how are they going to grow and learn? We have to believe in them, or else they can't believe in themselves. That's kind of the whole point. So this section after that, the section operationalizes creativity. So it's still in the discussion of creativity, but then we actually operationalize it, saying, okay, well, what exactly do we mean when we identify somebody as creative? So a part that I found particularly fascinating in this section was that we actually label things as more creative the more unfamiliar we are with them. So after that, on page 133, we're then led into this debate about whether operant behavior can be novel. So the main idea is that if nothing is ever exactly alike, then how can we identify it as the same? We can identify shared features and similarities, but that's about as far as we can go. So this passage actually also argues that creativity isn't special at all, which, that not that it's not special, but it's not novel, which is different, because it is just like any other behavior, and our reinforcement histories determine how creative we become, and then we perform or emit these creative behaviors. So it's not that creativity isn't special, but that it's not, so much more unique than any other behavior that we have had that's been reinforced over time. So after that, moving on to page 135 and box 7.1, there's a discussion of a set of studies. So I'm going to briefly discuss one with you, just very, very quickly. In 1987, Epstein used pigeons with smaller and previously learned skills, and then presented these pigeons with a complex situation. So he showed that these small, previously learned skills, things that are reinforced, things that these pigeons are confident in and have learned over time, can come together to make the pigeons seem more insightful. So this is the concept of generative instruction, where similar skills combine into more complex skills. So the book then dives into a set of research examples where this theory is supported. So when we come to the end of the creativity section on page 106, we then move into a section about credit. So if you think about it, credit is just reinforcement in general. You're technically getting credit for doing something. You answer a question correctly and you get an M&M. That's reinforcement and credit. So social praise in general can be really highly reinforcing. So after a discussion on praise, box 7.2 then discuss what when behavior just happens, or when it seems to just happen, or when we can't explain every individual situation because it's not possible to analyze every little moment that we see in everyday life, right? Which those of us who get really deeply into psychology or are passionate about it find that we do overanalyze a lot of things, and our friends might get mad at us or say, oh my gosh, you're being, that psychology student again, because we are looking at the motivation behind behaviors and we analyze it. But you can't do that with everything. So we have been reinforced over time without actually being aware of it. So going back to when behavior just happens. So for these things that we can't actually look at, we've been reinforced over time without being aware of it. So why else would we do anything or have any behaviors if they weren't reinforced over time, right? So we are inherently reinforced. Everything we do has been. After that, in the book, there's then a discussion about why we can't reinforce an individual, which was actually one of our interteaching questions. So by now, we should all know that you can reinforce a behavior, but you can't actually reinforce an individual. And for the sake of time, I want to highlight the important parts of the passage, but please, please, please message me with any additional questions on this part if you still would like clarification after the initial interteaching discussion, because this is a really important concept to understand. So we have this concept of giving credit for desirable behavior, which is positive reinforcement, because we add praise with the idea that the behavior continues, or with the intent that the behavior continues. So giving credit is positive reinforcement in certain situations if you use it correctly, and can be really strong. I know I, in particular, really like when people tell me I'm doing a good job and say, wow, you did this well. I'm more likely to do something if somebody notices it, which is extrinsic motivation, more so than intrinsic motivation. Basically, I'm saying, well, somebody says I'm doing a good job, so I am, and this goes into a full, long debate about whether or not intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is stronger, so I'm going to stop digressing and describe that the book then goes into a discussion of blame, and which is very, very closely related to credit, but credit is positive, whereas blame is definitely not, in most cases. And misplaced or inaccurately given credit is also discussed. So the passage, discusses the importance of controlling contingencies that might cause someone to behave inappropriately, so that the behavior is less likely to present itself in the future. So this relates to creativity, right? Because we're saying we can't make somebody more or less creative, but we can change their environment, reinforce them, and then over time they'll be able to emit or express this behavior. Where we're discussing blame and things like that, or misplaced or inaccurately given credit, we have to control these contingencies. We have to create an environment or situations where a behavior that we don't want is less likely to present itself in the future, just like a behavior we do want is more likely to present itself in the future if we use positive reinforcement. The book then relates this all to law, which I'm going to vastly oversimplify by saying that the author encourages the need for understanding not just the crime, but the intent behind a crime. So we all think like this. We say, oh, why was that person given the same sentence as this person? We see people getting arrested for terrible things. I'm trying not to say anything that might trigger anybody. We see people get the same crime sentence for things that other people get that maybe are not nearly as drastic, or maybe the circumstances, maybe somebody steals because they can't afford to feed their family versus somebody steals because they're a terrible person. So this passage discusses that we need to look at the intent, and this in general says, well, why do we blame in general? Is there a reason behind blame? And that goes into an entire thing about blame and credit. So I'm wondering if you guys think that blame is actually that powerful. How powerful do you think blame is? And do you think that blame is always more negative than credit, or that it can at times be a good thing to use blame instead of credit? So in general, people tend to take credit but are less likely to accept blame, which makes sense, obviously, because we don't want to say, yeah, I did something wrong. We want to say, yeah, I did something right. Oh, my puppy, I hope she doesn't come over. I'm almost done. Sorry, guys, if she does come over, I'm really sorry in advance. Um, so in general, people tend to take credit because that's what we want to do. We want to get credit for things that we've done. So what about responsibility? The chapter talks about, you know, it argues that taking responsibility is actually inconsistent with behavior, right? Is it reinforcing to admit that we've done something wrong? Why would we admit that we've done something wrong? So is this inconsistent with behavior? So I'm curious if you guys agree or disagree with this. It's my thought that we can be reinforced even if we take responsibility, because the truth and reactions to the truth can be reinforcing. And this concept of responsibility in general leads directly into conscience, because feeling guilty and wanting to do the right thing can also be reinforcing in different ways. So is guilt enough? What are your guys' thoughts on this? Is taking responsibility inconsistent with behavior? And this concept of responsibility in general, how do you feel about it? Do you think that we are giving too much power to blame and credit? And do you think that taking responsibility in general is inconsistent with behavior? So let me know what you guys think. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask.